Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on DER valuation, rate design, and the evolving customer role in the electricity sector. My name is Mark Silberg, and I serve as the Network Manager of the Electricity Innovation Lab, or eLab, at Rocky Mountain Institute. RMI advances market-based energy solutions, engaging businesses, communities, and institutions to cost-effectively shift efficiency and renewables. We employ rigorous research, analysis, and whole systems expertise to developing breakthrough insights. We then convene and collaborate with diverse partners, business, government, academic, nonprofit, philanthropic, and military to accelerate and scale solutions. A few logistical notes before we begin. There is time at the conclusion of the webinar for Q&A. With several hundred of you joining us today, we ask that you submit questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will do our best to answer many of them. In addition, this webinar will be recorded and made available to you in the coming days. Many of you are members of eLab. eLab is a unique community of electricity industry leaders from utilities, regulatory institutions, distributed energy resource companies, financiers, advocates, and others convened by RMI working to address three guiding foundational questions. First, how can we understand and effectively communicate the costs and benefits of distributed resources as part of the electricity system? Second, how can we harmonize regulatory frameworks, pricing structures, and business models of utilities and distributed resource developers for greatest benefit to customers and society as a whole? And third, how can we accelerate the pace of economic distributed resource adoption? To help offer some answers to these questions, I'm pleased to introduce our two supremely qualified speakers. Virginia Lacey is a principal in RMI's electricity practice, bringing over 10 years of experience across electricity regulation, policy, operations, planning, and finance. A founder of eLab, she's currently leading RMI's work on the Reforming the Energy Vision initiative in New York State. And Jesse Morris is a principal in RMI's electricity practice. He brings 5 years of experience working to reduce costs and establish value propositions for technologies ranging from solar PV to battery storage and demand flexibility. He supports RMI's collaboration with Clinton Climate Initiative to transition multiple Caribbean islands to 100% renewable electricity and transportation, and has conducted policy research and analysis to shape California's transportation policies. And with that, I now hand it over to Virginia to get us started.
Great. Thank you all, and thank you for joining us today. We are very excited to be able to host our inaugural webinar for our eLab network.
My name is Virginia Lacey, and very happy to be here with my colleague Jesse Morris to talk about some of the valuation topics that we have teed up for you today. And first, before we dive into the content, we've only got about probably 50 more minutes here, and we're going to be doing some highlights. There's a lot more detail in the substance that we've pulled together, starting with a review of solar PV benefits and cost studies, which is really about understanding DER value, starting with solar PV. Moving on to bridges to new solar business models, which is about optimizing that value now that we have a better understanding of it. And then finally, the economics of battery energy storage and the economics of demand flexibility, which is taking that optimization one step further to expanding the resource portfolio and really turning DER resources into a core resource for the electricity system. So with that, the topics we'll be discussing over the next hour or so is a framework for assessing value. So here I'll just give a brief tutorial about some of the basics of valuation as we have outlined in some of our own thinking and work. Best practices for evaluating that valuation, opportunities for optimizing value, and where we think the industry is heading next. So with that, let me start with framing the need. First, why are we talking about value? You know, for the last several years, distributed solar PV has been driving quite a lot of headlines. And some of those have been about impressive cost declines coupled with supportive policies, and innovative business models have propelled tremendous growth in the industry. Today, there are more than 867,000 solar PV installations in the US, with new systems being installed at a rate of roughly 1 every 2 minutes. The average cost of a residential system in the US was down from over $12 per watt in 1998 to roughly $3.50 per watt in Q3 2015. But those are not the only headlines that we've been seeing, and especially around net metering and a lot of the consternation in the industry, questions about equity and fairness. And when you dig into that, what you really find is uncertainty around value. The repeated refrain is whether customers with solar are fairly paying for the service they receive from the grid, and conversely, that customers who have solar are being fairly compensated for the value they provide to the grid. So maybe the question is not actually why are we talking about value, but rather who isn't talking about value. In data recently analyzed by the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Group, which also administers Desire, which is probably the best database on renewable policy in the US, they said, after looking at all of the data, that last year regulators, lawmakers, or utilities in at least 46 states studied, proposed, or enacted policy changes around solar valuation. That includes policy changes to net metering, the valuation of distributed solar, fixed or solar charges, third-party or utility-led rooftop solar ownership, and community solar. So it's definitely a major topic, and while solar is grabbing a lot of the attention these days, there's really a bigger story afoot, and that's about the broader scale of distributed energy resources and what makes distributed energy resources unique and a bit of a challenge when we're thinking about our traditional centralized system. And we've outlined that on 3 different dimensions. First is around siting, of course. They're smaller, more modular. They can be installed by disparate actors outside of the purview of centrally coordinated resource planning. From an operations standpoint, there are some challenges because we are talking about resources that are operating outside of centrally controlled dispatching mechanisms. And ownership. Of course, DERs can be financed, installed, or owned by the customer or third party, and broadening the typical planning capability and resource integration approach. The result is that customers' options are really expanding. So whereas traditionally electricity customers used to have one option, buy it from the grid, now there are multiple different options. You can make it with distributed generation. You can avoid it, reducing demand whenever load is operated, thus lowering the daily load curve. You can shift it. And we'll be talking about all of those things as part of this discussion over the next few minutes. The biggest challenge that we're really seeing and around net metering and all of the other major issues that have arisen, really when it gets down to it, you're looking at real misalignments, structural misalignments that are in conflict with the mechanisms that were designed for a centralized system. They're not well adapted to integrating or valuing distributed resources. So that comes in a couple of different dimensions around flexibility and predictability, about providing reliable power, being able to provide signals to customers that the cost or the benefit of any electricity resource, especially DERs, can vary by location and time. Additionally, and all of this comes down to value recognition and allocation. The mechanisms that we have in place to transparently recognize or compensate service, be it monetized grid services like energy, capacity, or balancing supply and demand, or less consistently monetized values such as carbon emission savings, those mechanisms are not transparently in place one way or the other, provided by the utility or the customer. So to the utility, revenue from DER customers may not match the cost to serve those customers, and to the customer, bill savings or credit may not actually match the value provided. So because of a lot of those issues, a couple years ago, we wanted to better explore and understand what really we can discern about distributed energy resource values. So we started with a basic framework, starting with solar and solar value. So the idea was we wanted to assess what's known and unknown about the categorization, methodological best practices, and gaps around the benefits and cost of distributed solar, and to begin to establish a clear foundation from which additional work on benefits and cost assessments and pricing structures can be built. So the basic gist of the work was reviewing 16 different benefits and cost studies by utilities, national labs, and other organizations, completed between 2005 and 2013, and they reflected a pretty significant range of value. The biggest point for the framework to start with, though, is when we were devising these categories, that we wanted them to be, they're basically agnostic to the direction. So when we're talking about value, we want to be clear that it could be a benefit or a cost. It's really about the order of magnitude of either one. And we're not necessarily reflecting who's incurring that benefit or cost with these categories. So moving into the variety of categories that we devised here, we can group them into a couple of different buckets. The first one was grid services. And so you can think about grid services as all of the things that are pretty much included in rates today. They're the direct benefits and costs that are incurred in the generation, delivery of electricity, and from operations to resource planning. So that includes energy, capacity, and what we were calling grid support services, to be a little bit more descriptive than our traditional ancillary services. Additionally to that, though, there's financial risk, security risk, environmental benefits or costs, and then social benefits or costs. I think the biggest thing to point out for all of these is that some of these are typically monetized, like what we see in rates, and then the others, for example, environmental and social, which we'll get to in a moment here, are typically or inconsistently monetized. And that's where we often see the most consternation in the industry around how to represent those benefits or costs. But as important as the categories of benefits and costs is also to whom those benefits and costs accrue. In fact, it's probably not just the categories of value that are the most important, it's where you sit when you look at benefits and costs. So two things to point out here. This is just showing all of the different actors within this space, from the utility to the participants to the non-participants, as well as society. And the arrows just indicate either the transferring of value or service. Just to highlight, a lot of the challenges that we have heard about are really reflected here on the participants and non-participants area. One is around equity. So are the participants actually delivering as much value as they are receiving? And non-participants, the biggest question there that a lot of regulators are contending with is whether or not the value that non-participants are ultimately receiving from these DER resources are actually adding up to a whole. So moving on from there, so we did find a significant range of estimated value across these studies. There were three primary drivers for that. There were differences in local context, input assumptions, and methodologies, and I'll talk about a couple of those in a minute here. But I think the other thing just to kind of point out is the perspective that was taken was either a ratepayer impact test or a hybrid societal cost test is what you're looking at. So when we're talking about the distribution of benefits or cost, the bars that you're looking at reflect that hybrid societal cost test or the ratepayer impact test. And what you'll see is that energy appears consistently across studies and is reasonably consistently as a proportionally large value. There's general agreement on the overall approach to estimating energy value. It's a lot easier to do. There's some agreement on the generation capacity, although there remain some key differences in the capacity methodology, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And then there's significantly less agreement, as I mentioned before, on the overall approach to estimating grid support services and currently unmonetized values, including financial and security risk, environment, and social value. Being that this was in late 2013, took a look at what the most recent studies have shown, and really since then there's a lot more studies and it's the same basic message. I think we have added up probably about 10 major studies that have happened in the last 2.5 years. New York is the most recent, which is highlighted here, and for the most part, again, we see a pretty wide range of value. So I'll just dive into what are some of the reasons for that. And we can kind of bucket that in 3 different ways. First, it's the local context. And that's the local system conditions that shape or bound the net value that solar can provide. I'll give some examples of that. Input assumptions. This is really about garbage in, garbage out, as they say in the modeling world, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the methodology, so the approaches to calculating in benefits and costs, some of which, as I mentioned, are a little less controversial, some more so, and I'll give a couple of examples. So for the local context, the system characteristics that is really important to think about is, one, the system or local demand profile. So depending on, one, your insolation level and what is the solar resource that you have within your territory, needless to say, you're going to have a very different value for your solar resource depending on how that value compares to the peak or the peak demand in your system. So this is just an example of from the APS study that was profiled of how solar capacity is measuring up to the peak in APS's territory. Another key is the generation mix and what's on the margin, as they say, in terms of the fuel that's being displaced. When you start to, when you're able to displace more kilowatt hours from fossil fuel burning plants, what's the fossil fuel that's being consumed? Is that gas? Is it coal? And when is that actually transpiring? So the example that's given here again from the APS study is a typical summer day and a typical winter day. And what you see is the red line is showing what the net impact is once you have more solar on the system. So in the case of the summer day, you have a lot of gas that's being displaced. In the winter day, you actually have gas and coal, but those are actually going to equate to different values when you look at over the course of the year or over a 20-year period for solar value. The other that I mentioned was input assumptions and methodologies, and this should really be intuitive, but I want to give a couple of examples. One is the vast and very significant driver of difference that fuel price assumptions make on energy value. And here I've just illustrated that with Arizona Public Services System, in 2 different studies that were conducted in different years, there were different assumptions about what the gas price was actually going to be over a 20-year period. In the first case in 2009, they were estimating that we were looking at a gas future of $9 in MMBTU to maybe $9.61 in 2025, comparing that with what we see in 2013, which is about a third of what the fuel price was estimated to be, and you also see what the obvious difference is between what the assumed solar PV value is. On the other side, in terms of methodology on generation capacity value, this is an example of also the same system, which is looking at California IOUs, with two different approaches to evaluating generation capacity, or that which PV might be able to displace when we're talking about a fossil fuel generating plant. And in this case, E3 on one side has a different way or approach of valuing generation capacity value and looking at long run and short run prices. And in the other, cross-border energy was actually took another approach, which is looking more at the long run value and applying that across every megawatt. And ultimately, it results in a different value placed on PV. So a few takeaways about best practices here that we've seen from our own work and then what's been happening over the last 2 years or so is that transparency is really key around assumptions, perspectives, sources, and methodologies. And the process really matters. So we've seen some studies that have been done in isolation by utilities where there hasn't been a whole lot of stakeholder engagement. That's been changing quite a lot over the last couple of years. But the process and having stakeholder buy-in is absolutely critical. Third, standardized best practices are absolutely possible and will help ensure accountability and verifiability of the benefits and cost estimates. So, you know, you have to explicitly decide if and how to account for various sources of value, so those categories, and be explicit about that. TVA recently released a study last year in which they did that and were calling out precisely why they weren't going to recognize that value stream, although that may not have been agreed upon by stakeholders. That certainly helped to provide the transparency that it was considered and why it wasn't included. Also applying widely accepted tools to estimating value that are credible and instilling confidence in the results. There's a lot of best practices that we have listed in the report that alludes to that and provides more depth along those lines. So looking forward, you know, this actually really is the transition to when we start to think about optimizing PV value. And the studies thus far have really largely focused on PV in isolation. And as we start to see in the next 5-10 years, there really will be a confluence of factors that will require a consideration of PV's benefits and costs in the context of a changing system, which is really the overall topic of what we want to provide a little bit more detail about today. The other thing is that in order to be able to capture the optimized value, we are going to have to evolve utility planning approaches. So one of the things that is probably a repeated refrain in several of the studies is that, well, there could be value there, but ultimately we're not sure that it's going to show up. We don't know that the PV is going to be installed, so we can't depend on it. That's ultimately, I think, the next area for engagement with the industry, and there's a lot of activity going on around that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. So optimizing solar value. The next area of work that we really looked into once we kind of had a better understanding of value is we undertook some efforts with the DOE Sunshot Initiative, a 3-year project to develop solar business model options that could better align the interests of customers, regulators, and utilities in the economic deployment of solar PV. And you know, here what we were identifying is a real need that as distributed solar expands into new markets and costs decline to Sunshot targets, it's driving a fundamental shift in economics and business models and operations across the electricity sector. We really need a longer-term perspective to guide near-term actions and approaches, and so our central thesis was focusing only on low-cost deployment onto the grid misses opportunities to optimize the delivered value of solar and mitigate potential costs as it's integrated into the grid. So fundamentally, to create a sustainable market over the long term requires an understanding of the value and then looking for opportunities to optimize that value. So what does that mean? Well, with a few different utility partners, we evaluated a couple of approaches for directly or indirectly influencing value. Those along two different dimensions, timing and location. The couple of those strategies is aligning the production profile of PV with the system peak. As I've already shown, that can make a big difference. Shifting the load to reducing peak and utilizing low-cost generation resources is another area. And then finally, co-locating distributed PV with major load centers or T&D hotspots. The way that we, so those were the strategies, and then the mechanisms we used was to try to incent optimal PV production from the highest system, for the highest system value. We were also looking at strategic demand side management to influence system load profile, and then targeting high value locations. This is just giving an example of the analysis that we conducted where we had taken a baseline of the value of solar in a specific territory with a specific partner utility, and without yet touching any of the demand side behaviors, we were trying to determine what would be the available new value by just adjusting the PV configuration to better align with peak. And in this case, what you see is that we actually are doubling the average value by changing the configuration, both for generation capacity and then increasing energy value as well. So the strategy here was optimizing DPV value by providing signals that incent the PV configuration to align with peak. Similarly, what we also were analyzing in another utility territory was siting PV at high-value hotspots and offsetting load growth by being able to identify the biggest constraint on the system and seeing if we could align PV's contribution to that locational area, thereby increasing the value that it brings by deferring a distribution investment. And in this case, we found we actually could triple the average value by targeting high-value hotspots. In both cases, we experimented with new pricing models, so the value of solar tariff, and then the second was a business model, solar as a grid resource, which is taking both of those approaches that I was just describing and integrating them into a business model that customers, utilities, and the solar industry could get behind. But that's only one different, or excuse me, that's one optimization strategy. There are numerous others when we're talking about expanding the portfolio of resources that we could couple with PV to really enhance its value. That's including energy efficiency, demand response, or storage. And that's where I'll hand it over to my colleague, Jesse, who will talk about the value of energy storage and some of what we've been discovering through those efforts.
Great. Thanks, Virginia. And Mark, I'm just going to ask you to flip through the slides for me. So again, I'm Jesse from RMI, principal in our electricity practice. And you know, what Virginia's alluding to is over the past couple of years, I and several others of us at RMI have been doing a lot of hard thinking and work on how other DERs like storage, like demand response, can augment the value created by distributed PV, and thinking about what value DERs like demand response and storage can deliver on their own. Now, we only have a little bit of time, but I want to give you a flavor for is how we've really been looking at valuation of some specific technologies. So where Virginia was talking about PV and different ways to just play with solar to get different value out of the system for multiple stakeholders, I'm going to be talking about first about storage and then what we call demand flexibility, which is very similar to demand response. So I'll go ahead and jump into it. Mark, if you can go to the next slide. Great. So we put out a report last year called The Economics of Battery Storage, and this graphic that you're seeing now was put up quite a few places on the internet. The report was looking to answer a number of questions around energy storage, but this graphic in particular was answering one question. What services can energy storage deliver to the electricity system at large, and to which stakeholder does most of the value accrue from delivery of that service? So before we talk about value, this slide's really talking about what the heck storage is doing for the system in anyway. So on the outside of the circle, we've got 3 different stakeholder groups, and those stakeholders are the ones that are going to be getting the most value from storage delivering one of those services. So on the top left, we've got customers. On the bottom, we've got utilities, and on the top right, we've got ISOs and RTOs. And those were kind of the 3 stakeholder groups that we very oversimplified the electricity system into. So for each of those customers, or for each of those stakeholder groups, there's different services that storage can deliver. For customers, for example, an energy storage system can deliver demand charge reduction. For utilities, energy storage can, for example, just like Virginia was talking about with solar, storage can defer distribution level investments at the utility level. And then for ISOs and RTOs, whether we're in a deregulated territory or a vertically integrated territory, some technology is delivering services like frequency regulation. Energy storage can obviously do that too. So that's what this graphic is showing, just looking at what services. The other piece that it's showing is our perspective on the grid edge. So the outermost light-colored red ring is saying when you put storage behind the meter, you actually have access to delivery of all 13 of those services. But as you move closer to the middle of the diagram, to the transmission level, you lose the ability for storage or other distributed energy resources to actually deliver some of these services. So for example, a distribution-sited battery cannot provide backup power or help a residential customer increase PV self-consumption at the customer level. Similarly, a transmission-connected energy storage system can't provide distribution deferral service, cannot help defer distribution level investments. So this is kind of our framework for just looking and thinking about energy storage from a high level. But since this webinar is about value, we have a problem. This isn't telling us anything about the value, right? Benefit minus cost that these technologies can deliver. So that's where we started looking, just like Virginia was talking about with solar, at all the different studies on storage. If you can go to the next slide, Mark. So right here, what this is showing is a summary of all the different studies that have tried to take a stab at estimating and generalizing the value that energy storage can create from delivering each one of these services. So this service list is going to look a little bit different from the PV one, and we don't have time to go through each of them, but I just want to call everyone's attention to one dynamic that's going on this slide that makes valuation so complicated and so difficult. And then I'll go into talking about how we've started to think about storage valuation. What you should take home is the spread in values across these different studies. In the solar studies, we saw spreads of the total value of solar between, I think, a few values in there from 3 cents up to 25 cents per kilowatt hour. First of all, the metric here is a little bit different. We're going to talk in terms of dollar per kilowatt of storage capacity per year. And let's look at those spreads. If there are any utility distribution planners on the webinar, they might be having a heart attack that we're trying to generalize the value of deferring distribution level assets. That's an exercise in futility because it's incredibly difficult to generalize a single level of investment. So if you look at the utility services here, distribution deferral, these studies have put a value on the value of deferring distribution level investments from about $50 per kilowatt year up to about $900 per kilowatt year. And that should intuitively make sense. Again, there's incredible variation in the number of technologies that are going in at the distribution level. So it just makes valuation and thinking about what a battery is doing very difficult to generalize. And you can see similar spreads, though not quite that dramatic, across the different services here. So in order to deal with this, this complexity that comes about in trying to value a distributed energy resource like storage, we start modeling very specific cases. So if you go to the next slide, Mark. I'm going to show a series of animations, and let me just set the context for a little bit and explain what you're going to see. We think that this concept of stacking is a really good way to consider what storage can deliver. So let's go to Arizona, and we're going to be a residential solar customer, and we're going to go onto a new rate put forth by Salt River Project that puts residential customers on a demand charge and also a time of use component for the energy part of their bill. And we're going to take a battery and we're going to see what kind of value we can generate, in this case, for the customer and the utility. The way we're going to show value is two charts. On the left, we're going to think about how many hours of this system's useful life is being dispatched to deliver a single service. And then we're going to fill out that pie chart on the left. On the right, we're going to show how much value, in this terms revenue, is generated from the battery delivering that service. And we're going to compare it to how much that system costs. So here's the baseline service. We're using this battery. We're dispatching it for 4% of its useful life to generate some revenue just from reducing that customer's demand charges. And you can see that the cost-benefit analysis there looks pretty poor when you're only thinking about one service and one source of value. The other thing to note before we look at other sources of value, 4%. That's a really interesting number in this case. Most C&I customers in places like California and New York that are using the energy storage system to pull down their demand charges, those batteries are only used from anywhere to 4% to 50% of their useful life. That implies that those batteries could be redispatched to get to deliver a number of other services. So an interesting aside, but you'll see why it's important. So Mark, if you could advance it once. Okay, great. So now we're stacking on a little bit of additional value from the battery, just arbitraging against that time of use rate. One more time, Mark. Now we're stacking a little bit more value. What if this customer was able to be paid by the utility for that battery and this distributed energy resource contributing to the local utility's resource adequacy requirements? Next slide. Now we're going to take some more of the battery's capacity to deliver a couple of ancillary services. In this case, spinning reserve and frequency regulation. Some of you might be saying there's no market for that in Arizona, let alone can behind-the-meter resources access those kinds of things. You're absolutely correct. In this case, we're just trying to think about what kind of value could be delivered given needed regulatory and business model changes. And then the last animation, Mark, this just shows what if we use the remainder of the battery's capacity to do some ISO level arbitrage, and then you also get tax benefits because this battery is charging 75% of the time through a solar PV system. So now you can see that's why the concept of stacking to us is a really interesting way to think about what is a battery worth to a customer and the utility, because obviously some of these services that in this case the customer is monetizing, they're actually delivering value to the utility by reducing the peak. Okay. So very briefly, we're at a quarter till. The last piece I wanted to talk through was the other report. And Mark, you can go to the next one. This is talking about what we call demand flexibility. And Mark, if you go to the next slide, very briefly, what we looked at with this report, and again, it's on exactly this topic of valuation, is what if you took a single-family residential home and you gave them all the technologies on this slide. So you equip this customer with a Nest. You give them a dryer that you can actually time so that it turns on in response to different price signals. You gave them a grid interactive hot water heater, top right. You allow the electric vehicle that's deployed at this customer's premise to be charged at the right times of the day. And then you also install a very small battery. We've got a picture of the power wall. So this is the question the report was asking. If you equip customers with these technologies and then you put them up against a number of different emerging rate structures, what kind of value can be created for the customer and for the grid? Next slide, Mark. Very briefly, we call this demand flexibility for a couple of key reasons, and it is very similar to demand response. It's worth just calling out exactly what those reasons are. Demand response, traditionally, it's very much grid-focused. It's driven at the wholesale level. It's relatively slow to scale, and typically only called upon infrequently and in emergency events. Demand flexibility, what we're calling on the other hand, it's very much customer focused. It's driven from the retail side, either by tariffs or other incentives that utilities are putting out there. These technologies can have additional value beyond energy that really helps to scale these technologies because they're attractive to customers for other reasons. And it's used frequently, it's always on. So if we go to the next slide and we think about these customers with these technologies, here are the trends in rate design we were putting them up against. We were thinking about, okay, if I'm a customer with those technologies, how can I respond to, for example, time-varying energy pricing? How can I respond to demand charges? And how can I respond to reduced export compensation for PV or increased fixed charges? Interestingly, and this is what the top of this slide is saying, 65 million customers in the US are already eligible to opt into some of the rates that have a flavor of this. Okay, so this is what the Demand Flex paper was testing. Let's take these rate design trends and let's see what happens when you allow a customer whose load is flexible, whose demand is flexible, to respond. And Mark, if you go to the next slide. I'm just going to sit on this one, and then we'll stop because we don't have a ton of time to go further, and we want to take questions. This is just an illustration of what happens when you make a customer's load flexible. The top one is showing this is a Hawaiian solar PV customer, residential, and at the top it's just your baseline solar system, and you can see the yellow solar production curve, and then you can see all the loads turning on and off throughout the rest of the day. In that base case, this customer, who we're modeling underneath a zero compensation export tariff, so anything that's exported, any solar production that's exported, they're getting paid zero for. This customer is exporting, base case, 50% of their solar kilowatt hours. But on the bottom, if we use those demand flexibility technologies to basically push as many of those loads underneath the solar production curve as possible, that customer goes from exporting 50% of their solar kilowatt hours to self-consuming 90% of their solar kilowatt hours. Now that's a big deal from an economic perspective, and I'll go to the last slide, Mark, and the next one. This customer, this is just a summary chart. If you look at the third bar over, rooftop solar with no export compensation, this is basically saying a solar customer with these demand flexibility technologies would be able to save 33% off of their electricity bill, okay? We did that exercise for 4 cases in this demand flexibility report, which this chart is summarizing, and really identified some pretty serious savings for customers that install these demand flexibility technologies. I forgot, there's one more slide. So this is a customer view of value, and then what this slide is showing is a grid view of value. We were just showing what the bill savings could be for making those customers demand flexible. What this slide is showing is let's take every residential customer in the US. Let's give them those demand flexibility technologies, the Nest, the flexible electric vehicle charger, the controllable dryer charger, the electric hot water heater that's grid interactive, and ask, what are we doing in terms of system level benefits? Well, this was our rough answer. When you make all of those loads flexible, you're able to avoid investments in generation and T&D, largely by driving down the peak. You're able to lower production costs, and then you also have reduced need for a couple of ancillary services by making those loads flexible. So what this is saying is that in addition to creating value for customers by using those demand flexibility technologies, you also create value for the grid by reducing needed investment by about $13.3 billion a year. So that's a big finding from our Demand Flex report. Apologies for the speed. We can take some questions after Virginia closes us out. But again, all of the detail on these reports and others can be found on our website, and we can help point you towards them.
Great, thanks, Jesse. Yeah, so just to wrap up, as you probably picked up on over the course of this talk, the issue of DER value is pretty complex, and it's popping up all over the country in all sorts of venues, creating all sorts of debates. So why does it matter so much? It's because each regulatory proceeding, each demonstration project, each question around DER value is not actually happening in isolation. Together, the opportunities and challenges around distributed resources may be seen as a powerful wave. Multiple forces creating a massive wall of water with enough power and force to alter landscapes. And the thing about waves is that while they may build for miles, they can crest really quickly. I have a few friends who ride some big waves, and they know that deft moves and some quick reactions, managed risks, and thoughtful strategy mean the difference between survival, or of course an exciting ride, and maybe smashed into a rocky shore. And in the context of DERs, the foundation that allows for that thoughtful strategy is clearly understanding DER value. But we know, what we know is that there are 3 main ways to respond to a big wave. We can combat it, putting up defenses and trying to stop it, and many of the activities and proceedings around DER value now, such as many of the debates about fixed charges, fall into this category. We can wait and see, and there's several, probably much of the industry is in this camp right now. Or we can embrace the wave and find ways to harness it for the economic and environmental advantage of customers. And this is the approach that states like New York and California are currently taking. And we think that the way that we respond does matter, because those collective responses will ultimately lead us down one or two paths. In the first path, we find a way to capture the value of DERs, accurately reflecting both the benefits and the cost of those resources and leveraging them to create a more optimized system. And in the second path, we put up barriers that restrict the role of DERs and leading to a suboptimal system, likely higher cost system overall. And we'd like the first. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and we'd be happy to take whatever questions you have.
Thank you very much, Virginia and Jesse. We've had several questions come in, and we'll be able to field a handful of them in the next 6 minutes. So one question for the two of you is about implementation. Are there utilities out there in the US or maybe abroad that are actually field testing some of the costs and benefits that we've modeled? Or is this research so cutting edge that it has just barely seeped into the consciousness of markets and utilities?
I can start, Virginia. You feel free to tack on. Short answer, yes. There are many utilities, domestically and internationally, that are experimenting with many different flavors of what both Virginia and I talked through. I'll give a favorite example from recent territory because of the politically charged landscape in the U.S. Glasgow Electric, municipal utility in Kentucky, is partnering with, I think it's Sunverge, storage developer, residential storage developer, putting batteries on this utility in Kentucky's system to basically pull down peak demand and seeing what kind of value they can create with that single battery application. So that's one of who knows how many different examples of utilities experimenting with these things. Virginia, I don't know if you have a favorite.
Well, actually, I mean, I obviously have a lot of preference for what's happening in New York right now around a lot of the demonstration projects that are going in, and Con Ed and a number of other utilities there are really starting to experiment and try and see if they can quantify the values of even behind the meter distributed energy resources in a variety of ways.
So we had another question come in about cost of service regulation on the grid and load defection pathways. And the question is, to expand upon a little bit, Virginia, perhaps, why the cost of service regulation arrow is leading to grid defection. And shouldn't we value, as we have in the past, cost-based rates and regulations? Isn't this one of the least cost pathways to meeting greenhouse gas regulations?
Yeah, so I think that the reason why the cost of service regulation listed that list on the arrow is leading down to grid defection is really because without new approaches to pricing in which we can start to show and provide value signals to customers that have the ability to respond and provide true grid value, there is a risk that those customers will defect. And so that's the reason why we've highlighted it that way. And it's not all or nothing, certainly not, but we do see with more fixed charges and the higher those fixed charges, that ultimately we will see with the continuing trajectory with different storage technologies or other distributed energy resources, as Jesse had outlined in demand flexibility, that it can even lead to load defection or grid defection on a grand scale. So that's why we highlight it in that way.
We've had a couple of questions come in now about both community solar from the bottom up, communities organizing into community solar projects, or utilities providing DER services in bundles to their customers. So size projects that are somewhere between the meter and the feeder. Jesse and Virginia, I was hoping maybe you could elaborate on the role of community solar in similar size projects and perhaps address some of the issues related to ownership, be they from the utility, from the top down, or from customers themselves self-organizing.
Sure. obviously a lot of innovation and thinking going on in community solar, and even going beyond calling it community solar and just calling it shared solar, because that can be done obviously in a number of different ways. You've got several states that allow virtual net metering, and I'm guessing that's where some of the questions are coming from, is folks in states where virtual net metering is an option. In other states, it's not an option. And frankly, in some of the other deregulated markets, we can talk about Texas in a moment, but I think, yes, community solar is solving a very real problem, which is that many customers cannot have access to DERs like rooftop solar because they're either renters, they don't own their property, they don't have the right FICO score, et cetera. So it's solving a very real problem. What I'm really tracking and interested in now are different companies that are offering, quote, community solar-like offerings in places without virtual net metering. In Texas, there are retail electricity providers now providing basically 100% green options. They're priced relatively competitively, and they're tied directly to production from a solar farm. So are you virtually net metering? No, but you actually have some sort of ownership relationship with panels on a specific farm, and your accounting in terms of your kilowatt hour consumption versus your kilowatt hour generation from that farm is there and available for you to see. So those are the kinds of innovations that I really like looking for, are community solar-like models in states that don't have access to virtual net metering.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jesse. And I want to be sensitive to everyone's time today. So thank you for your patience at the beginning of the webinar, and we hope you'll join us for those in the future. This webinar has been recorded, and the slides and the recorded webinar will be available and sent to all registrants within the coming days. So thank you very much, and stay tuned for future eLab webinars.